world have been creating a global economic regime that usurps country sovereignty and imposes harmful economic policies. T Proposition will tell you today that direct democracy promotes free trade that is more legitimate, less corrupt, and more economically productive. But before we get into the debate, what do we stand for on side proposition? We tell you that free trade agreements are a generally good thing. However, we think they require direct democratic consent in order to avoid some of the more pernicious distributional consequences which we think can occur. Also, we think that some free trade agreements are currently being prevented by special interests. We think they're much more likely to pass these sort of free trade agreements under our side of the house. So, what do we mean by free trade agreements? We tell you they can be bilateral or multilateral agreements that liberalize trade. We think that they are either firstly about the removal of tariffs, subsidies, and opening up access to foreign markets. But secondly, we think that recently they've become increasingly concerned with strengthening intellectual property rights and international arbitrational bodies as well. So what does this look like in the real world? We tell you that the referendum we propose on our side will largely follow the Swiss model we think currently exists, with a few differences. That is that free trade agreements negotiated by the executive and deals are proposed to the general public in a national referendum without prior parliamentary ratification. We said on our side, to ensure things like voter turnout, we're happy to sanction employers who prevent their employees from going to polls and introducing national voting holidays to ensure that people turn out and vote. We're also okay with designating official campaign groups based on yes or no model we think exists in England. I'm going to be forwarding two key arguments in this speech. Firstly, that it is required as a matter of democratic legitimacy that free trade agreements are ratified by direct democracy. Secondly, that on our side we get better free trade agreements. My second speaker, Mohammed, will be telling you about how for the developing world, we think that referenda promotes better long-term development strategies. So on to my first argument today about why we think as a matter of democratic legitimacy, free trade agreements must be ratified by direct democracy. First off, we tell you that direct democracy is and should be a default measure. We think that even though we're willing to often cede decision-making powers to representatives, we think that we only do so when we believe that they would make decisions in accordance with the informed will of the people. We tell you, however, that free trade agreements are beyond the scope of representatives' authority. We have three reasons for that. First reason we tell you is that free trade agreements fundamentally alter the nation's governance process. This is in four ways. First, we tell you that they determine future legislative questions that the legislature can't vote on in the future. This is because these agreements hamstring democratically legitimate institutions from making contradictory decisions in the future. Secondly, they delegate authority to international bodies like the WTO. Third, the exposure to international markets subjects that country's markets and their laws to pressures from outside governments and other institutions. And lastly, we tell you that free trade agreements create massive costs to changing your economic policy in the future. But note here, we say that just as constitutional ratifications require referenda, we say that because of that authority, we think that these do as well, these sort of agreements. Second reason we give you is that representative democracy is liable not to reflect the interests of the people in this particular case. We think that this is because representatives are subject to capture, that is to say that democracy is the best check against corrupt representatives. Why is this? We tell you that firstly, free trade agreements are typically low information because negotiations often happen in secret. That's to say that we can't have a meaningful conversation and argument about the TPP because it's very difficult to find out concrete information concerning it. Secondly, we tell you that free trade agreements concern policies that are of high value for special interests. Third, we say that there is less democratic accountability because free trade agreements are handled through foreign policy measures. That's to say that they don't need to be ratified by things like the House. No, thank you. We think that the costs of free trade agreements are also often borne by people without significant political resources. That's to say these are types of people who are like low-skilled workers. We say on our side, we empower these people to have control over such agreements because we think they have significant numbers, however, under the status quo, not significant power. We think that these reasons collectively mean that representative democracy cannot reflect the interests of people in this case. But also we tell you that free trade agreements are difficult issues to work through in things like elections. Two reasons why. Firstly, we think that you don't know when that vote will actually happen. But secondly, we tell you that often these details are kept very secret. So what that means is in terms of democratic legitimacy, the free trade agreement must be ratified through direct democracy. Second argument in today's case about how we get better free trade agreements under our side of the house. On proposition, we tell you that we think that free trade agreements are generally a good thing. Why is this? Before I tell you why, yes.
So would you support using referendum for foreign policy?
So no, we think it's distinctly different from free trade agreements. We think that firstly, for the reasons I've already told you about the fact this affects a wide range of people in different elements. But secondly, we think that importantly, that it differs from foreign policy due to the fact that we think that these sorts of instances are directly accountable to the people. We think that that's something that they need to know. Second argument in today's case about why we get better free trade agreements. We think on proposition, free trade agreements are generally a good thing. Firstly, because they provide comparative advantage. Secondly, because international capital flows into that country. And thirdly, we think we expand markets for domestic goods on our side of the house. So we think that we limit the bad free trade agreements we think exist on their side. Why is this? We think in certain cases they have negative distributional impacts that make them particularly bad. We think the instances where this happens is, for example, when there are wholesale migration of industries creates a cycle of structural inequality that condemn the most vulnerable to decades of destitution. We tell you that this is literally what happened in Eastern Europe when they were forced into open markets and forced to liberalize. We tell you that secondly, they exacerbate existing inequality. That's to say, when we look at places like Elkhart and in Indiana, when we passed NAFTA with sort of issues that it faced because it wasn't allowed to go through referendum, we think it put thousands upon thousands of people in automobile industries out of their jobs. We tell you that doesn't happen on our side. But thirdly, we tell you, one, sort of free trade agreements with excessively punitive intellectual property enforcement, for example, free trade agreements between the European Union and South Korea that involve extending the duration of medical patents, won't be popular and will be voted against on our side because the legislative is not the ones making decision. We tell you we avoid these ones because firstly, we think they're harder to capture entire electorates, where we think it's much more easier to capture Congress itself. But secondly, we tell you we get more good free trade agreements. We think the types of free trade agreements that we're talking about that are good are ones which have entrenched industries that are politically but not economically important. We think that these are the types of ones that where they have low labor, highly subsidized industries that have large margins and concentrated wealth that they can use to capture the state. We think that these free trade agreements are beneficial in this case because they expose these industries to foreign competition and drive prices down and increase the quality of life. We tell you that these referendums on our side make these free trade agreements much more likely under referendums. Firstly, because they aren't labor intensive, but secondly, because we improve the plight of consumers. That is to say that they're going to be much more popular in society and therefore we're going to be voted by large margins. That's why we think that on team proposition today, not only have we proved to you that there is a democratic principle here that requires a legitimacy to vote for these things by referendum, but secondly on our side, we provide better free trade agreements that they don't provide. We beg you propose.